I'm pleased to be joined by Kenneth Adams, President and CEO of the Business Council of New York State. Welcome to CityWide.
Thanks, Ken.
So, Ken, how's business?
How's business? You know, it depends who you ask and where you ask them. The state as a whole, business across the state is not like business here in the city. I mean, I tell a lot of people, I'm new in the job as you know, tell a lot of people that there's kind of an economic halo around Manhattan. And it leads people to believe, I think sometimes in a sort of mistaken way, that the economics of the state are solid, when they're not. They're not. I mean, upstate really has some very sort of fragile economic conditions. You could look at a lot of different measurements, but the upstate economy is hurting. The Hudson Valley is doing well, Long Island's doing all right, and certainly New York City is doing fine. But as a state, we've got to do a better job at looking at the big picture and making sure the rising economic tide of the city starts to float boats around the rest of the state.
That is your job as the new head of the Business Council. Tell us a little bit what the council is.
Right. 27 years ago, in 1980, the Business Council was created by merging two different organizations. The then Empire State Chamber of Commerce, sort of a statewide chamber of commerce, with a manufacturers association called Associated Industries. The two groups were put together and they came up with a new, I guess, a name down the middle, the Business Council of New York State. So in the end, we're the largest, most important business association in the state, and we function kind of like the state chamber. Our real goal is the economic development of the state, but again, across the state. And these days, that means we have a real focus on revitalizing the upstate economy. But I have to tell you, our members, over 3,000 companies, are all over the state, and they're in every economic sector you can imagine. So it's a very diverse membership, mostly small businesses, but large, important corporate players as well, some of the great legacy companies of the state, and IBM, Corning, Kodak, MetLife, JP Morgan Chase, and so on. They form the Business Council. We're based in Albany, actually, though I run back and forth between here, the city, and Albany. And we work on policies to improve the economy of the state.
Do you provide services, or is it just an advocacy organization?
You know, it's a couple things. We do primarily advocacy, again, to improve economic conditions and to help our member companies. But we also provide services to our members. We have a lot of discounted insurance programs. We run a workers' comp self-insured trust for 635 manufacturing companies to get them discounted, if they have good safety records, discounted workers' compensation insurance, a couple other programs like that. And finally, we do a lot of education, seminars, events all over the state on environmental themes. We just held our annual environmental conference on taxation up at Saratoga earlier this week, a series of things on homeland security, sectoral approaches, in other words, looking at parts of the economy and creating events and bringing people together in various parts of the state to drive services and assistance to support different parts of the economy.
Eliot Spitzer ran for governor on the slogan that on day one everything would change. And on day one, pretty much, one of the things that happened was he met with you and he met with the head of the state AFL-CIO. Right. What did that represent symbolically and substantively, both the fact that he was felt important to meet with the head of the largest business association right away, but also that he was, in effect, deeming the head of the state AFL-CIO right. as your equivalent.
Right.
What did that tell us?
Well, I mean, I think it, for one, it was in a way carrying through a campaign pledge, which was as the candidate. Candidate Spitzer had long emphasized the need for workers' compensation reform. So first, there was a lot of momentum here. And it's a reminder, too, Ken, that the Business Council, under my predecessor's leadership, had made workers' compensation reform in New York State a huge priority. And in fact, at the annual meeting of the Business Council last year up in Bolton Landing, New York, the governor, while campaigning, came and pledged that he would take on this issue. So our organization, this is before my time, had a role in making this workers' comp reform a front burner, a major issue, a major priority in the campaign and with the governor. So there was a history to our relationship with the governor once he was elected, and I had a relationship with him, and I think there was a level of comfort in terms of me stepping in to lead negotiations for workers' comp reform on behalf of the business community. Likewise, it was an opportunity for me to work with Dennis Hughes, who's a terrific person and a friend, and who Dennis and I co-chaired the governor's transition committee on workforce development and labor issues. So we had a previous relationship. We got our groups together, and during about a 12-week period in negotiations led by the governor's team, but that incorporated leadership from the Senate majority, from Senator Bruno's office, as well as representation of Shelley Silver's office. I'd like to say that was a deal with really 5 parties at the table. The Senate, the Assembly, the governor led it, business and labor. An interesting model, Ken, because it really helped us get workers' compensation reform done. Historic legislation passed into law on March 13th. It had been decades. But by the way, this was an issue. Not everybody wakes up, or as Joe Bruno likes to say, brushes their teeth in the morning thinking about workers' compensation insurance. But this was an issue for the business community, actually for governments, for town and local governments, for employers across the state, that had just become a critical barrier to business growth and to new investment because the cost had risen compared to other states to astronomical levels. So bringing those comp costs down, reforming the system, making it work better for injured workers, making it work better for employers who need workers to get their treatment and get back on the job. I mean, that's all part of the reform, and it was historic and important. And frankly, yes, very good that the Business Council and me in my new role as its leader had a chance to step up and play such an active role in that.
If my recollection is correct, there were ads run by the Business Council last year, I think before you came on board, touting Joe Bruno. Basically, these were promotional ads for Joe Bruno, but paid for by the Business Council. You have a Democratic governor now. The state assembly has been less favorable to business, or at least perceived as being that way. The state Senate being the hallmark of the more conservative and I guess pro-business approach. But now you have a governor who is committed to changing control of the legislature, to taking Joe Bruno out as the leader. Where does that put the business community?
Well, it's an interesting issue because you have a governor who's making that pledge or expressing that political desire, but who also, I think, at least as he started during the campaign and in his first 6-7 months in office, has, I think, made a commitment to economic development. The governor is really a pro-business Democrat, if you will. Workers' comp reform is one of several examples of areas where he really is, again, I think, driving an agenda that is supportive of business. He's very mindful of that. And he, again, it's just an interesting dynamic because the governor has pledged in his, basically his inaugural address, and then after that, the State of the State address, to judge him by what he achieves to develop the upstate economy, get the upstate economy back on track. So there he is with that commitment, and yeah, it's interesting because the Senate is a very important partner. It's to the business community. The Assembly can be as well, but it's really a system of balance. You know, there is a fair amount of balance. In the close of this year's legislative session, there were a number of bills that were not helpful to businesses that made their way through the Assembly, and as in typical fashion, it was the Senate that wouldn't introduce the bills or wouldn't move them. Some, in the end, did get passed by both houses, and now, in fact, the governor, you know, have those bills, and we'll see what he does with them. But there has been historically, you're quite right, a balance between sometimes policies that are not always helpful to economic development or to small business owners that come from the Assembly in some cases, and at the same time, the Senate is, as you say, kind of a backstop to that and a control for that. Well, down the middle, you know, what we got to end up with is something down the middle.
But the checks and balances can so easily become toll roads and blockades up in Albany. Right. What happened with legislation to reform the process by which power plants are sited? We've been hearing for many years that we have a shortage of energy. Right. There's a huge push now to get a new transmission capacity that is more environmentally sound, right. And yet it seemed to have hit a wall.
Yeah, this is Article 10, which is the long expired citing law in New York State that makes it possible for generating companies to plan and site, you know, locate, build generating gas or historically coal or other things. And it is a fundamental issue for the state because, as you point out, there is really peak demand in these hot summer months, and we barely have enough electricity to meet our demand around the state, and there hasn't been any new generation created in New York State with the exception of wind power, and that is important, but it's infinitesimal in the scope of the megawatts that the state requires. So there is, I should also back up to remind you that when we survey business owners across the state about what's in the way, of their business growth, what are the obstacles to investment, to attracting new business to the state, and to their success, the problem is, you know, you've got, according to our members, the high cost of health care and health insurance, workers' compensation,
we're gonna talk about that,
and then energy's number 3. So, you know, New York's got the 5th most expensive electricity in the country, and that affects consumers, residents, viewers of this show, and business owners across the state. So, to your point, this is fundamental, and the fact that a deal on Article 10, legislation to reinstate a modified version of the citing law, kind of fell off the table in the waning days of this year's legislative session because of politics, is a real problem. It's a problem for all of us in the state who need more affordable energy. What do you do to get it back on track? The Senate has had a bill which they have historically pushed, supported, The Assembly has a bill, the Governor has a bill, and I have said to people, why not approach this the way we approach workers' compensation insurance, which is when you've got these varying interests, and you have the environmental movement, you have business, you have generators, you have responsible representatives of these various interests into a room with a goal of getting to a compromise, some type of citing bill, because some bill that allows for enough generation, new capacity, lower prices is better than nothing, which is what we have right now. Nothing. So I am really hopeful that this can get sort of back on a summertime agenda because of the things that didn't happen at the close of this session in Albany this year. The citing law, the Article 10 not happening is really a problem for, again, business owners, the economy, residents all across the state.
We're going to continue this conversation with Ken Adams when CityWide continues right after this.
Yes, you are. Come here. Let's see how this looks.
Hey, how's my little horse?
She's a lion.
Yes, she is.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Kenneth Adams, president of the Business Council of New York State. Before the break, we were talking about two of the priority items for the council this year in the state legislature. One was workers' comp reform, huge historic success on that. The second was the process by which power plants are allowed to be built around the state. No consensus on that. The third priority, I think, for you is health care, the cost of health care, the difficulty of recruiting and retention for small businesses that can't afford health care. Tell us what you're hearing from your members and what you think needs to be done about it.
Well, a couple of things on healthcare. First of all, it is really the leading issue if you talk to business owners, which these days really means small business owners across the state, 500,000 of them actually, will tell you that half of them no longer provide any kind of health care coverage for their workers. Not because they don't want to, but because they simply can't afford that monthly premium. So the cost of care goes up, therefore the cost of the insurance goes up, and the business owner can no longer provide that to his or her workers. And you see an expansion of the government-funded programs, Family Health Plus, Child Health Plus. It's an important piece to really provide coverage to the uninsured, but it's not a solution in a state where 62% of us who have insurance in New York State get that insurance from our employer, from the place of work. That fundamental, that sort of foundation of employer-sponsored care needs to be strengthened, not weakened.
Now, how do you do that? Who should pay for it?
It depends who you're talking to. I mean, what we're interested in, as an example, is a program that Governor Pataki started and that, frankly, had a lot of good ingredients, but because of marketing or other issues, didn't really take off. It's called Healthy New York. Healthy New York uses a concept of reinsurance. In other words, the state takes a block of money, provides it for reinsurance for certain types of claims actually between $5,000 and $75,000. All the other claims below that and above that are picked up by the insurance company. That reinsurance mechanism enables the insurance company, and these are all your basic insurance companies around the state, to price their insurance for qualifying small business at a lower rate. You can take that mechanism of reinsurance, for example, and apply it to certain types of businesses for whom this is the most significant problem. So right now, Healthy New York says it's got to be under 50 employees. Healthy New York says you have to have a certain number, about a third, of low-wage workers. It's not for 50 people in a law firm, for example, because it's supported by the government. So a model like that, Ken, is something we think can be expanded or maybe better targeted and marketed to this rising gap of small businesses that can't afford health insurance anymore. That's one part of the story. Another part of the story isn't just insurance as the way to pay for health care. It's the cost of the care itself. Rising health care costs are a fact. I mean, it's something that we know, inefficiency in the system. We're very interested at the Business Council in better implementation of health information technologies, HIT. If you think about so much innovation, so much technology has swept through American industry in the last 20 years, really making it, enabling it to stay competitive at an international level. There are a couple of sectors of the economy where really the technology leveraging effect has not occurred. Healthcare is certainly one of them. When it comes to managing care, information about care, all sorts of issues in diagnostics and treatment. And the issue here is, what are we doing to bring down the cost of the care, and then what are we doing to create insurance products so that small business owners can once again afford to get that for their workers?
I want to talk about the other side of affordability for a second. I have met people who have told me that they have what they consider to be good paying jobs, jobs that pay $15, $20, even $25 an hour, that they have difficulty filling because the worker would make just enough money not to be eligible anymore for Medicaid.
Right.
And given the choice between losing their health insurance, their Medicaid, or taking that job, they'd rather take a lower paying job. Right. Is it just about bringing the cost of that down, or how do we broaden the scope so that those kinds of workers feel the benefit, not just the business owners?
That's that's a tough question. It's a very good issue. It's part of a bigger question, which the governor is looking at as we've talked about, this idea of universal coverage and some system of universal coverage in New York State. Now that concept, of course, everybody would swear by because it simply means everybody has a way to pay for his or her health care, universal care. So the question is to get there. And Jim Talon, who's an expert on this at the United Hospital Fund, has a program he calls sort of roadmap to coverage, roadmap. Now in that roadmap, you've got to put all these different pieces together, including that piece you're looking at for the low-wage worker, and look at this question: at what point should that low-wage worker be a Medicaid recipient? At what point should the small business owner get a subsidy so the person is in a plan that is really designed by and paid for by the employer? Because remember that if the employer is paying half or 3/4 or even 100% of the premium, that's premium dollars that's not being paid for by the taxpayer. Remember that out of our state budget now spends $10 billion a month. Right? We're at $122 billion in this year's budget. About $50 billion of that, $50 billion, it's outrageous, is the Medicaid cost. Now, some of that's federal dollars, as you know, but the point is we can't simply keep asking the taxpayers to pay for all of the health care costs. We've got the business community at the table historically and still willing to play, but we've got to, again, piece together for various parts of the population, working, not working, young and old, a system so that everybody gets coverage and the burden is shared in an equitable way.
There's also, I think, a question of general affordability, particularly in New York City. We're going to talk about upstate in just a second, but the cost of everything seems to be going up. Scarcity of housing, there's even water costs more, energy costs more, everything costs more today. A lot of people advocate raising the minimum wage. Historically, the business community has resisted that. It doesn't seem to have hurt the economy when it's been affected. There's also the notion that jobs should pay a living wage, that if somebody works a 40-hour week or a 37-hour week, they ought to be able to support their family at a sustainable level, particularly if the business in question gets some type of subsidies or tax breaks from the government. So where does the Business Council come down on raising the incomes of workers?
I don't think it's not a front burner issue for us. We weren't really involved in any significant way historically in issues related to the minimum wage, for example. I'm sure we have members in some businesses that are affected by that, but frankly most are not, because most of our members pay well above minimum wage to their workers, and it wasn't really, again, a major issue for us. And I think our position with respect to issues like living wage, minimum wage, is first and foremost, from our point of view, Ken, we want to see businesses grow and prosper and hire more people and play a greater role in their communities. And we see economic development and community development and business development as something that we've got to find ways to stimulate, usually by reducing costs, to your earlier point.
Well, also, in my sense, particularly your own philosophy is that the distinction between business development, economic development, and community development is not a strong one, that all of those things, that you can't build the community unless you build the business.
You've got to do it all. People need jobs. And again, I would say with respect to issues about looking at workers' salaries, you've got to look at that in this broader context of cost. Because the fundamental, again, going back to some of the fundamental issues you've already mentioned today, if you look at insurance costs like workers' compensation or liability insurance, if you look at energy, if you look at, business owners look at payroll as a fundamental part of their costs. So there's not one ingredient. It's a series of obstacles that make it so hard.
When you were listing your priorities, I didn't hear taxes in there.
Well, taxes actually comes out, I got to the first three, just to quickly review. Healthcare, health insurance, workers' comp, energy. Taxes is 4. Taxes plays out in a lot of different ways for business owners. It sort of depends what type of business you're in, and are you in a situation situation just based where you are in the state, where your property taxes are becoming an increasing burden.
A retail store who's a tenant cares about the sales tax.
Right.
The
so
owner of the building
so it
cares
plays
about
out.
the
So
property
taxes
tax.
are a big theme, because taxes, especially upstate, and again, areas of the state that have fragile economies, a rising tax burden just gets harder and harder and hurts our competitiveness.
You keep using the word fragile. I think that's a euphemism. There are cities upstate, industrial cities that are losing population, they're losing jobs, consolidation of headquarters, they're the losers, globalization, moving to the Sun Belt, whatever it is. Is there a way to solve them, or is it this is just the inevitability of history? They're in the wrong demographic.
Give you an example. Look at manufacturing. 35% of our business council members are manufacturers, and yes, New York State still has a lot of great manufacturing businesses, but not what it once had. That industrial powerhouse, that legacy of the manufacturing base of the state isn't there. In the last 6 years alone, from 2000 to about the end of 2006, New York State, predominantly upstate, lost 122,000 manufacturing jobs. Each one of those jobs, a good paying job with benefits, and people supporting their families, supporting their communities, the sort of the effect of that spending in those communities, you can imagine how devastating that is. Over 100,000 of those jobs lost. So are we going to bring those jobs back? Not the same jobs, no. I think the issue is recognizing the sort of economic conditions that exist in, again, a vast swath of central and western New York and the southern tier and up into the north, recognizing those conditions and trying to create a more competitive and receptive environment so new investment will come back into those communities, but it won't be factories making, auto parts. So it'll be other things.
Why should New York City care? Historically, upstate has had this disdain for the city. There's some elements of race involved with that. Upstate legislators have gotten in the way of New York City trying to reform itself or drive its own destiny. Why should the people who watch this show, who live predominantly in the city of New York, care whether or not a Syracuse or a Utica or a Rochester is successful or not?
Buffalo's insolvent. The city of Buffalo's in receivership, right? It's economically devastated. We're paying for it here in New York City. There was a time, as you know, historically, when the city was in crisis and the tax base in the 70s upstate was powerful enough that the upstate economy at a statewide level was bailing out the city. Those fortunes have reversed to the benefit of the city. The city's economy is doing great, and that's wonderful. But now the city of New York, again, that $122 billion budget we have as a state, we're all in this together. We're bailing out the upstate economy right now. So how much longer do those of us in New York City, forget about the moral obligation. Well, don't forget it. I would posit that we have an obligation to act as a state and take care of our brothers and sisters all over the state. But economically, how much longer do we want New York City, which may be doing well now, to have to carry the burden of a failed economy in upstate New York? There's 16 million people in the state. Half of them may be here in the city. What about the other half? So I think we have a moral obligation to care about this and to be concerned about the upstate development, economic development. But we've got a pretty practical fiscal one, too, since right now the city is carrying the load. We need a better balance, and we need, and frankly, this is part of my new role, this job that I have, being a New York City person, a Brooklyn person, asked to run the Business Council of New York State and commuting up to Albany 3 days a week, every week. I'm the third person to run the organization, the first from downstate. My predecessor, Dan Walsh, you knew Dan, was from Olean, New York, from Western New York. So I, more than anybody now, feel this compulsion to try and get people here in New York to understand that we're one state, the economy of upstate really needs thoughtful support, practical policies to drive down cost, attract new investment, find new ways, the innovation economy, tourism, healthcare, education, lots of things we can talk about. But we've got to drive economic activity and restore life and vibrancy to our upstate cities and towns.
My thanks to Kenneth Adams, President and CEO of the Business Council of New York State. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us.